So let's start from the beginning. Can you share a little bit of your background and what drew you to sociology?
Yeah. So I live in Florida now, but I was born and raised in a really, really small town in northern Michigan, on Lake Michigan.
Hmm.
So my town has one stoplight, just to give you a perspective of how little it is. And
Okay.
people fight over whether or not that one stoplight should be there, but that's another story. So it was a very, very limited space, and both of my parents are social workers. So I think when I was born, they had an intention that I was going to see life outside of this little town, no matter what. And, social work doesn't pay great, but they took what they could. And every summer we would travel, and we would drive because my mom doesn't fly. So we would drive everywhere. I mean, we drove from Michigan to the California border. We drove to Florida.
Yeah.
My dad is a veteran, so we went to DC a lot and saw all the stuff there. And they just made it a point that anything that said historical monument, historical site, someone, historical slept here, we stopped and we looked at all of it. And they made
Mm.
sure that I had that perspective that the world is much bigger than this little town I was living in. I also really, really loved to read. And I grew up in the 80s. So the Scholastic Book Fair was like a massive deal for
Yeah,
us.
I remember that.
And so I would get it down to the penny of how much money I had to spend at this thing. My parents' money, obviously, but they would give me a
Right.
budget. And, I would buy everything I possibly could. I would read everything I possibly could. This drove my mother nuts, I think, in a good way, because she would buy me something
Hmm.
and in a day I would have it read. So she made a
Yeah.
deal with our librarian, our little small librarian, local library, where she said, listen, I know the limit is 12 books for 2 weeks. Can you let my kid have 14 for 12 for 2 weeks? Because financially, this is not great. So that's where we started, was just parents that really wanted me to know that there's more to
Hmm.
life than just what we're looking at here in this little town. I don't know why I don't know why I specifically chose inequality as an area, other than it's always just been something that I've been very aware of. Sociology
Hmm.
came to me because I did a bachelor's degree in a program called liberal studies, which people think means I studied liberal stuff, which that's not true. It's a way to structure your own degree. So I wanted to do an interpersonal communications degree. My college didn't offer that, but this program did. So I had this
Okay.
heavy philosophy based education. And when I got out, I thought, I don't know what to do. So I worked at a women's center for 3 years and did
Mm.
their volunteer coordination. And then I was also a trauma, I don't say counselor because I'm not a therapist, but I was a trauma specialist, maybe was the word, where if someone was
Okay.
sexually assaulted, they would come to the women's center and they would kind of be funneled to me. And then I would help them with resources and get them where they needed to be treated. And doing that for 3 years was a very clear path of, I need to understand what makes people unequal. I wanted to do
Mm.
a women's studies program, but at the time they were very, very few and far between to do any sort of gender studies graduate school program. So I found sociology, and it had a gender component. And I just sort of said, well, I'll just make it work. And kind of the story of my education is square peg, round hole, where I sort of fit, but sort of don't. So I went
Mm.
into a sociology degree and found a way to still kind of focus on the gender aspect that I wanted to focus on, but got this kind of bigger education in terms of like society structure, social structures, cultural structures, all of that stuff.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions to piggyback off of that. The first one is, so I understand being a woman, a natural focus on inequality towards gender. How did race and sexuality come into play with that? And then also, personally, how did it affect you working at the women's shelter? Because I did a crisis line at the when I was going to the University of Maryland. Um, and I worked for the school newspaper, and there were so many things that were happening to women on campus that I had no idea about, that I found out about the crisis line, and I couldn't do it. It was hurting my heart too much.
Yeah.
So how did you personally reconcile with the fact that you're helping women? I mean, you're helping them, but the stories that they've gone through
Hmm.
are traumatic and heartbreaking.
Hmm. Um, yes. I have learned that I am excellent in a crisis. Like I am I am a person that can stay calm. I'll cry my eyes out later. Like after the fact, I will
Hmm.
have a good solid cry. But in the moment, I probably, again, because of my parents doing what they did, my mom worked with people or she worked in a retirement facility. And my dad worked with abused and neglected kids. They're both still alive now, but they're retired. I've always had this model for me of when crisis is happening, when trauma is happening, we're going to stay calm. We're going to get through it. I've also educated myself a lot to know that this person is in this moment right now. They're not going to stay there, and they're
Hmm.
going to move past it. Um, and I think part of that also is knowing as much as I knew about how trauma works, how people are going to be in the initial space versus how they are at the end, knowing that there's a light at the end of the tunnel for them. You kind of got to a place where you could look at someone and go, okay, this person is going to be fine. They just need a little something right now.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously, yeah, it affects you, which is, I think, what motivated me to want to it's one of the factors that motivated me to want to dedicate my life to understanding this more and eventually working with college students where I can share what I've learned. The question about race and sexual orientation and kind of how all of that works. One of the things you learn when you start to study gender inequality is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. That all of that
Hmm.
stuff is intertwined. You can't just look at one and not look at the rest of them. It's for the person who can, they're a better scholar than I am, I guess, because they are all connected. And if you don't grasp that and understand that and embrace all of it, you're not doing your job in terms of what it means to be a scholar in that field. Um, that said, uh, besides the fact, I was raised I was a teenager in the 90s. And so things like pop culture stuff really started to impact me, like things like The Real World coming out. And
Hmm.
if people aren't familiar, there was a man in the real world San Francisco called Pedro Zamora. And he was one of the first people on television to have HIV and AIDS. And he died basically while the season was being aired. And that was massive for me to be able to see that. When Matthew Shepard was killed in '98, he was a young gay man in Laramie, Wyoming. Um, that was huge for me to see things like that playing out. And we say representation matters and we say that you need to see things in order to understand them. But those two examples were kind of our first real demonstration of the power that pop culture can have on somebody's um, development and psyche, because it clearly affected mine because I still think about it, 30 some years later. Um,
Hmm.
they're all intertwined. You can't have one without the other.
Yeah, the intersection between race, gender, and sexuality. I've interviewed a lot of different people, and it's funny. You say inequality for gender, women, right? But also, if you're a Black woman, there's also an
Mm-hmm.
added inequality of being Black. If you're a Latino woman, or a Latino man, or a gay man, or a gay Black man, or a gay Black woman, there's intersections all over the place. If you like that clip, go ahead and hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to catch up on all of our latest content. Don't forget to hit the notification button when you do subscribe so you can get updated every time we release content. We release content every day, whether it's an actual show or clips from the shows. So go ahead and subscribe, like, comment. Also, don't forget our Patreon page where you can find our Talking Straight-ish and After Hours Uncensored episodes. That's patreon.com/unsolicited perspectives. But once again, thank you again for listening to Unsolicited Perspectives. I'm your host, Bruce Anthony, and I'm going to catch you next time. I'll holla.